The introduction of a book, article, or video about a particular weapon usually emphasizes its crucial role in history. But today we are talking about a sword that does not need such grand introductions. In fact, quite the opposite. Modern movies and literature tend to overhype it, often at the expense of other, more popular melee weapons of the past. But before we dive into the topic, let us answer a simple question. What exactly is a sword? A sword is a type of edged weapon with a straight double-edged blade, designed for both slashing and thrusting attacks. If the blade is straight but sharpened on only one side, that is a backsword. If it is curved, that is a saber. Swords first appeared in the Bronze Age and essentially evolved from daggers. Naturally, for a weapon to be considered a sword, it must meet certain minimum size requirements. There are different views on what the shortest possible length should be. One perspective defines swords as weapons with a blade longer than 60 centimeters. Another sets the threshold at 40 centimeters. The latter seems more reasonable considering that Roman gladius swords varied between 45 and 65 centimeters depending on time and place. The word gladius itself means sword in Latin, so if we only consider blades longer than 60 centimeters to be swords, most gladii would not qualify, and that does not seem right. The hilt of a gladius was typically 15 to 20 centimeters long, with the weapon's overall length ranging from 60 to 85 centimeters. Short swords were more practical in tight formations. However, they were also used as secondary weapons by warriors who did not rely on such formations. A good example is the Scythian Akinakis, which was even shorter than the gladius, with a total length between 40 and 60 centimeters. The dividing line between short and long swords is generally set at a blade length of 70 centimeters. Although long swords are usually associated with the Middle Ages, they actually appeared much earlier. The first examples, measuring about 1 meter in total length, date back to the Bronze Age, around 4,000 years ago. With the advent of ironworking, long swords appeared among the Cimmerians, a nomadic people. A well-known example is a Cimmerian sword from the Subatov settlement, with an impressive blade length of 94 centimeters. Nomadic cultures favored long-bladed weapons because they were more practical for mounted combat. Speaking of Cimmerians, if you are familiar with Robert E. Howard's fantasy works, his character Conan the Barbarian was a Cimmerian. He could very well have lived somewhere in the Azov or Black Sea steppes. While the Romans are typically associated with short swords, by the 1st century Anno Domini, they also used a long sword called the spatha. The spatha's blade ranged from 60 to 80 centimeters, with an overall length of 75 centimeters to 1 meter. This kind of weapon was not well suited for tight infantry formations, so it was primarily used by cavalry. After the fall of Rome in the 5th century and the beginning of the Middle Ages, the tight Roman formations disappeared, and the long sword became a versatile weapon for both mounted and foot soldiers. At the same time, it transitioned from a common soldier's weapon to an elite weapon, accessible only to a select few. Medieval swords came in an incredible variety. Some of the most well-known types include Carolingian swords and Viking swords, which emerged around the 8th century, as well as the slightly later Romanesque swords used from the 11th to the 14th century. There was no universal length standard. Some believed that swords were occasionally custom-made to match the owner's height. I have come across this theory multiple times, but whether it is backed by medieval sources is unclear. Overall, the range of medieval long swords can be summarized as follows. Blade lengths from 70 to 106 centimeters, with an overall length between 80 and 120 centimeters. Many of these swords had very short hilts, sometimes under 10 centimeters, and in some cases as short as 7 or 8 centimeters. Owners of these swords clearly did not have massive hands. I think it is fair to say that the average long sword had a total length of about 1 meter, even though the metric system did not exist in the Middle Ages. But aside from long swords, there were also hand-and-a-half swords and two-handed swords. Medieval sources did not always bother classifying them, which makes life difficult for modern researchers. Logically, hand-and-a-half swords, which became widespread in the 13th century, should be longer than single-handed swords. But that is not always the case. Their total length typically started at around 1 meter, but some examples were shorter, going up to 130 centimeters. So, it was not unusual for a single-handed longsword to be longer than a hand-and-a-half sword owned by someone else. A great example is the Type 20A sword, according to Oakeshot's classification. Its blade length ranged from 56 to 86 centimeters, while Type 18A had a blade of around 68 centimeters. These swords were actually shorter than many one-handed swords but were still classified as hand-and-a-half swords. The main difference was in the grip. A hand-and-a-half sword had a handle long enough to fit a second hand, either fully or partially. The weapon itself was designed for both one-handed and two-handed combat. Around the same time, true two-handed swords started gaining popularity. These swords had long grips, at least 25 centimeters, but before the 14th century, their total length rarely exceeded 130 centimeters. By the late 14th and early 15th centuries, the Middle Ages were slowly coming to an end. At the same time, a whole range of new two-handed swords emerged. One of the most famous was the Scottish claymore. Its name literally means great sword. The blade alone averaged 110 centimeters, while the total length was about 1.5 meters. In Germany, they had Zweihänders, no fancy names here. The word literally translates to two hands, meaning two-handed sword. And unlike the Scots, the Germans did not hold back on the metal. Just the blade could be 1.5 meters long, and the total size often exceeded the height of the average modern person. Another notable type was the flamberge, recognizable by its wavy blade, which some even attributed near mystical properties to. The idea behind the flamberge was that its curved edges concentrated the impact force into a smaller contact area, making cuts even more devastating. Some sources claim wounds from these blades healed worse. Though, let us be real, if you got slashed by a two-hander in the Middle Ages and somehow survived, you were already pretty lucky. On the other hand, the risk of infection and gangrene was still sky-high, regardless of the weapon that hit you. Flamberges came in different sizes. Two-handed versions were usually around 1.5 meters long, but some reached 170 to 180 centimeters. The largest surviving sword is the Great Pierre, measuring 2 meters and 15 centimeters in length and weighing 6.6 kilograms. Many modern video games and anime creators have drawn inspiration from weapons like this. Like heavy plate armor, truly massive two-handed swords only became widespread towards the end of the medieval period, around the 15th and 16th centuries. And just like plate armor, they soon faded into history, making way for lighter, more practical melee weapons.